It's Scotland in mid-July and we've had a really good June full of wet, humid weather in order for the Chanterelles to come early. Today we're going to be showing you what to take with you, more importantly where to look, and then how to cook them. So on our chanterelle hunting today, I've got three items. I've got a wicker basket, which is got plenty of holes in it to let the mushroom spores fall through and hopefully propagate more chanterelles. The second item I've got is a brush in order to clean them. And third item is a knife, which we can use to cut them from the ground. Come on in, let's go. So there's four things I like to keep in mind when hunting for chanterelles. The first is looking for a piece of high banking that's well drained, such as this. They often like to grow on top or on the side of them. The second is we have a deer path created by animals running underneath the bank or on top of the bank, and it's actually helping to scatter the spores of the chanterelle. You often find them right next to the paths. The third is the bank is currently in the sun because it is kind of southwesterly facing. So I often find that the banks that are southerly or westerly facing tend to be quite good for chanterelles. The fourth thing is that the piece of high ground which we're looking on is above a boggier, wetter piece of ground. Unfortunately this bit is a bit dry, and although this piece of land suits the conditions, we didn't find any here. So we're going to have a look around the forest and see if we can find other pieces of land that suit these characteristics and see if we can find any chanterelles there. So we found our first patch here. Interestingly, there are pieces of moss, sort of boggier ground over here. There's very wet ground and the whole thing is kind of draining down there, so we're on a southwesterly facing slope. Kind of classic conditions. Surrounded by birch trees and beech, and not too much foliage, so there's room for the chanterelles to come up. Also note that they run entirely through a deer path leading over here off into the bog. So I believe there's two schools of thought. One is to cut the chanterelles low down, thus not damaging the mycelial network. And then there's other theories about just pulling them up like this, and then it doesn't actually harm the mycelial network at all. So basically we're just going to clean them off, any dirt or grass, give them a little brush, pop them in the basket and continue gathering. Over here is some quite boggy ground with dry ground draining into it and some birch and some Scots pine, so I'm going to follow the boggy fence line and see what we can find along there. I've had really good success around birch trees recently, and we've just come into a bit of the forest which is very rich with birch. Over here we have some boggier ground with the grass, a tiny dike, and then a deer path going across. Here we go. A beautiful patch of chanterelles. Wow. Chanterelles here, it's quite amazing. They're all around the roots of this birch tree here, just on a bit of high ground above the bog. Classic position. Also we've got good kind of all day sun here, and the deer path. Yeah, they're obviously quite mature because they've got, let's pick one, quite thin edges at this point. So they must have been here for about maybe a week or two already. This is the most I think I've ever come across at one time, so I'm quite excited. I'm going to pick all the good ones and let's see how many we get. Here's a good example of when they get a little bit older. You can see that the cap has gone from being convex to sort of almost concave, and the edges here have become very thin. Always remember to look in the wee holes because there might be some hiding down there as well. Pretty good haul. I think we've probably got about a kilo. The smell from them is incredible. Apricots, peaches, very fruity. Remember, always check next year the same patch. Hopefully next year, if we have good weather, good wet and warm weather, these will be popping up again and we'll have another harvest. So let's see if we can find any more. Another good example here of chanterelles on the high ground. We're on a kind of a nubbin of the hill, and we're surrounded by kind of boggy grassland around. We've got birch trees surrounding us as well. Bit of moss keeping everything nice and damp. Just pulled up a cluster of chanterelles, kind of all coming from the same spot. There's maybe 4 or 5 attached together. I'm pretty happy with that. I think I'll head inside now and I'll show you my favourite recipe for cooking them. Let me show you a few features of the chanterelle so you can get familiarised. I've got them laid out here in order of maturity, starting with a young one to sort of middle-aged and then becoming quite old. Note, let's first look at the cap. So when they're young, the cap is convex, so it's folding down, and when they're becoming very mature and old, you can see the cap's funneled up like this, so it's coming up, and more notable on maybe this specimen, it's starting to even curl back around on itself. So the young ones that were in direct sunlight tend to be more golden on the cap and also on the underside. You can see on this one here, I think this was hiding in the shade, it's actually quite pale underneath compared to, say, this one here, so it's less golden. On the top there's a classic sort of chanterelle deformity where you get some frills popping out in the middle of the cap. Chanterelles, good to note that they're always very frilly in their maturity. They sort of swirl around and they frill up. They only resemble a round mushroom in their young maturity stage. So they become very obviously chanterelles when they grow up. Here's one that's probably a bit old to eat now. It's quite wet, so the cap's darkened. It's been eaten by slugs and spiders and things. Underneath it's a lovely golden colour, and it's got the very prominent chanterelle veins you can see. Quite rubbery and always forking at the end of the cap, a bit like lightning. So if we have a look inside the chanterelle, this one is has been sort of exposed to a bit of moisture. So it's beginning to become a little grey inside, but the fibres are almost chicken-like. You can see them there, very white inside, quite a contrast to the cap. On a slightly drier specimen, let's rip that open. You can see it's very white inside and fibrous. There's no hollow aspects to the stem, it's just completely straight longitudinal fibres. I left the chanterelles on a windowsill for 2 days to help them dry out a bit, and they're a bit drier now and they should be perfect to fry and they won't give out loads of water when we fry them. So we're going to do a classic fried chanterelle on toast. We're going to cook it with some fancy smoked garlic, shallot, spring onion, and we're going to fry them in a good wedge of butter and then season them with parsley, salt and pepper.